On a cold, rainy morning in a small coastal town, they called him a dangerous dog and prepared the paperwork to put him down. No one understood why he didn't look at people, only at the sky, as if he expected something terrible to fall from above. But that moment, a reclusive veteran stopped his old truck. With one glance, he knew the fire in the shepherd's eyes wasn't rage at all. It was the echo of a war the dog never truly left. Kandotishchen. Rain drifted in sideways off the Pacific, turning the streets of Astoria into a sheet of silver. Behind the county animal control truck, a German shepherd paced in a narrow steel crate, claws ticking against the floor. His name was Ranger once, though no one here knew that. To them, he was just case number 274B, a dangerous dog with a file and a deadline. The crate was bolted to the open tailgate, a rectangle of bars and shadows. Ranger's chest was heaving, his thick black and tan fur damp with sweat and fog. Every sound made his muscles twitch. A car door slam, the clank of a chain, a seagull's harsh cry overhead. His eyes kept jumping up toward the roof lines like he expected the sky itself to strike. Officer Rick Daniels cursed under his breath as he checked the bandage on his forearm. The white gauze was already stained through with red where Ranger's teeth had sunk in. Rick's jaw was tight, eyes hard, the posture of a man who had been bitten before and promised himself it would never happen again. "Should have put you down on the street," he muttered. In front of the truck, a knot of people from the coffee shop had gathered under the awning, phones out. The bravest stood closer, filming. One of them, a skinny teenager in a hoodie, Jaden Cole, held his phone high, already narrating for the camera. "Yo, look at this psycho shepherd. This dude just tore into a cop. They better put it down." The shelter director, Elena Brooks, stepped out from the low concrete building, her scrubs covered by a blue rain jacket. She was in her 30s, dark hair tied back, eyes carrying the kind of tired that coffee never fixed. She took one look at Rick's arm, then at the kennel where Ranger slammed his weight into the door again, metal ringing like a bell. Her stomach dropped. Ranger's world was smaller than the crate that held him. It was sound and pressure and heat. The clang when his body hit the door. The sting in his paws where claws scraped metal. The roar in his ears that wasn't the rain, wasn't the street, wasn't now at all. Somewhere behind his eyes, mortar fire bloomed, and the sky over Astoria blurred into a different sky entirely. He threw himself forward again, shoulders cracking against the bars. To the crowd, it looked like blind rage, a mad dog trying to break free and finish what he started. But his eyes weren't on Rick, and they weren't on the people filming. They kept flashing up, searching the empty edges of the flat gray clouds, tracking something only. He could smell. Elena's phone buzzed in her pocket, twice, then again. She didn't need to look to know who it was. The county commissioner, George Dalton, had been calling since the bite report hit his inbox. When she finally answered, his voice came fast and thin through the speaker. "That's the dog from the video, right? You know how this looks. I want that liability off my books today." Jaden was still filming, narrating the moment like it was content, not a life. "This is Astoria, Oregon, guys. This is happening right now outside the animal shelter. Dude, he tried to go for the officer's throat. Look at him. He's crazy. Drop an F in the chat if you think they should put him down." The comment counter on his screen was already racing upward. A low growl rattled out of Ranger's chest, but it wasn't aimed at the kid or the cop or anyone else on the ground. His ears were flattened tight against his skull, tail tucked so far it almost disappeared. He was shaking, every muscle wired. The smell of wet pavement and exhaust twisted into burned rubber and sand in his mind. Above, a seagull screamed, and he flinched like it was incoming fire. Down the block, a faded blue pickup eased to a stop at the curb. The engine coughed once before going still. Behind the wheel sat Luke Carter, a man whose name most people in town knew, but whose face they rarely saw. Graying hair under a ball cap, beard uneven, old flannel under a worn field jacket. He had meant to drive past, like he always did. Luke's hand moved to the shifter, ready to slide the truck back into gear. Then the sound cut through the glass and straight into his bones. Not just barking, not the blunt edge of aggression. It was sharper, broken, a staccato panic he hadn't heard in a decade. His fingers froze on the stick. For a moment, the smell of salt air was gone, replaced by diesel and dust. He turned his head, just enough to see in the side mirror. The shepherd in the crate hit the door again, body slamming steel, then snapped his head upward, eyes wide, tracking the horizon like it was hostile. Luke's chest clenched. That posture, that frantic scan for a threat above, didn't belong to a backyard biter. It belonged to a soldier who knew exactly where death came from. Luke killed the engine without quite deciding to. The sudden quiet in the cab rang in his ears. Outside, the rain tapped on the windshield, the crowd murmured, Ranger's cage shook. His mind offered him an old command. Not your problem. Keep driving. Stay on the hill where nothing can find you. But his body was already moving, door creaking open into the damp air. Rick noticed him first, this tall, lean stranger stepping onto the sidewalk with the wary grace of someone who hated crowds. "Sir, you need to stay back," the officer called, holding up his good hand. "That dog's violent. We're taking care of it." Ranger lunged again, metal screaming, and the crowd recoiled in a wave. Luke didn't. He just stared. For a few seconds, it was as if everything else in the lot fell away. The phones, the rain, the commissioner yelling through the speaker. Just a man on the sidewalk and a dog in a cage, both of them shaking for different reasons. Luke saw the terror in Ranger's eyes, the way his paws were already bleeding, the way he refused to look down at the people shouting at him. He recognized the pattern, and the memory of another shepherd's last stand tightened around his throat. He took one slow step toward the truck, voice rough from years of disuse. "You're not looking at a monster," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "You're looking at someone who's still in the war." Elena turned, caught by the sound of a stranger defending the dog everyone else feared. And before Dalton could bark another order through the phone, Luke added, quietly but clear enough to cut through the rain, "You're reading him wrong." Morning on Carter Hill came quiet and slow, the kind of quiet that felt deliberate, like someone had turned the volume down on the world. Luke Carter woke before the sun, same as always, lying still on the narrow bed in his one-room cabin while he waited for his heartbeat to remember it was in Oregon, not overseas. Only when the shapes around him settled did he breathe fully. The cabin was more habit than home. Rough pine walls, a small wood stove, a table scarred by years of elbows and coffee mugs. On a shelf above the sink, 3 cans of soup lined up like soldiers, labels facing forward. A leash and an empty collar hung on a nail by the door, the leather darkened by old sweat and rain, the metal ring worn smooth from a hand that no longer reached for it. Luke swung his legs over the side of the bed, feeling the old ache in his knees complain like they did every damp morning. He flexed his left hand, then his right, out of habit more than need. The right moved easily. The left, wrapped in skin and scars and something that was no longer entirely his, felt heavier. He tugged his sleeve down without thinking, hiding the line where metal met flesh. Outside, the trees were still half asleep, branches black against a sky that was just starting to pale. He opened the door and let the cold air roll in. It smelled of wet earth and fir needles, the clean kind of cold that should have been simple. Somewhere far off, he heard a logging truck groan on the highway, the sound low and steady, not the high, broken notes of distant artillery. For a moment, he just stood on the threshold, listening. There had been a time when a dog would have been there too, pressing a warm weight against his leg, nose testing the wind before he did. The memory came with the name before he could stop it. Atlas. Black and tan, like most shepherds, eyes too serious for a young dog. a soldier who happened to walk on 4 feet. Atlas had never seen Carter Hill. His world had been sand and broken concrete and heated metal. He had learned to move where Luke moved, stop where Luke stopped, trust the pressure of a knee, and a single soft word. They had shared a language no one else fully understood, a thread of trust Luke had believed nothing could cut. Back then, he had been certain of at least one thing. In the cabin now, his certainty had shrunk to a list he could hold on one hand. Flour, coffee, diesel, enough firewood stacked by the stove to make it through another coastal winter. Anything beyond that felt like a luxury, and luxury felt like something he didn't deserve. He pulled on his flannel shirt, then the old field jacket, making sure the cuff on his left arm stayed in place. He filled the kettle and set it on the stove, watching the tiny blue flame catch. The quiet around him thickened again, like insulation. On the wall above the table hung a single photograph, the only one he had kept. 4 men in dusty uniforms, squinting into the sun, and at their feet, Atlas, tongue lolling, ears pricked, the only one who looked like he knew what was coming. The kettle hissed as the water started to simmer. Luke poured the coffee, black and strong enough to wake the dead, then carried the mug to the window. The glass was old and rippled, but he could still see the gray line of the Columbia River in the distance. The town of Astoria crouched around it like a secret he wanted nothing to do with. Down there were people, questions, noise. He told himself he had made peace with the distance. Up here, no one asked why he flinched at fireworks or why he never rolled his sleeves. No one said the word handler or asked what had happened to his dog. On the worst nights, when dreams slammed him back into streets half a world away, he could walk out into the trees and let the cold soak him until he came back. It was a kind of survival. But some mornings, like this one, the quiet didn't feel like shelter. It felt like a lid. His gaze drifted to the empty collar on the nail, the brass tag turned so the writing faced the wall. He didn't have to see it to know what it said. K9 Atlas. Somewhere deep in his chest, a hollow space flexed, the way it sometimes did when he heard a helicopter or smelled burned rubber on wet asphalt. He drank the last of his coffee and set the mug down with more care than it needed. The truck needed fuel. He was low on kerosene and flour, and the generator had been making a new sound he didn't like. Those excuses formed a little ladder in his mind, sturdy enough to climb down from the hill for a few hours. He picked up his keys from the hook and forced himself toward the door. On the drive down the narrow road, the forest opened in glimpses between the trunks, offering brief views of the river and the town beyond. The old pickup rattled over potholes, the engine a familiar vibration under his hands. Luke kept his eyes on the curves ahead, not on the life below. Every trip he promised himself it would be in and out. Store, fuel, back to the hill. No detours. At the edge of Astoria, the world changed from trees to clapboard houses and neon signs. Luke's grip on the wheel tightened the way it always did when he crossed from shade into open air. He passed the grocery store, the feed shop, the gas station. The county animal shelter sat just beyond them, a low block of concrete he normally ignored, simply a shape he flicked his eyes past. This time, he didn't get to ignore it. Before he reached the turnoff, the wind carried a sound up through the cracked window of his truck. Not just barking, not the eager clamor of bored kennel dogs. It was sharper, desperate, the harsh rhythm of a body slamming against metal between broken cries. A sound that reached across 10 years and 2 continents like a hand on his shoulder. His foot eased off the gas before he knew he'd moved. The engine's hum dropped, drowned for a heartbeat by the echo of another day, another dog pinned in a different kind of trap. In his head, Atlas froze, ears flat, staring at the sky a second before everything went white. On the street ahead, the shelter lot came into view, crowded with people, phones held high, a crate shaking on the tailgate of a county truck. Luke pulled onto the shoulder without thinking, the truck rolling to a stop in a wash of gray light and drizzle. From here, all he could see was the blur of a German shepherd's body hurling itself at Steele, and the way its head snapped up, scanning the horizon like the air itself might explode. He sat there, hand hovering over the keys, caught between the hill behind him and the war still living in that sound. Rain beaded on the bars of the crate, tracing thin silver lines down the metal. Ranger stood braced on all four paws, chest pumping, tongue flecked with foam. His body was aimed at the door, but his gaze stayed high, flicking from the edge of the shelter roof to the power lines above. Danger lived up there in his mind, not in the faces staring at him. Elena ended Dalton's call with a tight thumb and slipped the phone back into her pocket. Her stomach twisted. She hated these parking lot scenes, the gawking, the phones, the way fear spread faster than any facts. "Rick, step back from the tailgate," she called. "You're bleeding through the bandage." Rick scowled, but gave the crate another wide, angry berth. Luke closed the truck door behind him with a soft clunk and stepped onto the wet asphalt. For a second, the weight of 30 eyes dragged at him, but his attention never left the shepherd. He saw the tremor in the dog's flanks, the way his nails scraped for purchase each time he hurled himself forward. Not rage. That was a body trying to outrun its own memory. Jaden swung his phone toward Luke, sensing new content. "Yo, we got somebody from the woods coming in," he murmured for his live stream. Maybe he's animal control backup or something. To the old-timers clustered along the curb, Luke was more campfire story than neighbor. Seeing him in town in daylight was unsettling, like watching a ghost look both ways and cross the street. Ranger caught the new silhouette in his peripheral vision and froze mid-pant. The crate vibrated around him as he shifted, nose working the air. This man smelled different from the rest. Pine smoke, diesel, old canvas, sweat that held no sharp tang of adrenaline. His ears twitched uncertainly. The man wasn't staring him down, wasn't yelling. He was just there. "Sir, I said stay back." Rick's voice cracked across the lot as he stepped in front of Luke, planting himself between the stranger and the truck. Pain and leftover terror flared in his eyes. "That dog is level 4 aggressive. He's already taken a chunk out of me. We have orders to euthanize. For your safety, get back behind the tape." Someone obligingly stretched a strip of yellow plastic looser as if it actually meant something. Luke didn't look at Rick. His gaze remained on Ranger, watching each twitch like it was part of a language. "He's not coming for you," he said quietly. Years of disuse made his voice rough. "If he wanted you, he'd be staring right at your throat." Finally, he glanced at the officer's arm. "Where'd he tag you? Inside the truck? On a pole?" The questions were sharp, precise. Elena felt a spark of irritation rise and then ebb. She stepped closer, wary but curious. "And you are?" she asked. Then, realizing he might bolt, softened her tone. "I'm Elena. I run the shelter. County says we don't have a lot of options here." Her eyes flicked to the phone peeking from her pocket, still buzzing with Dalton's unread messages. Luke took a breath, like he was about to step into cold water. "Name's Luke Carter." The words felt heavier than they should. He let them hang a second before adding, "Used to work dogs, Marine Corps, K-9 handler." That last part changed the air. Rick's mouth shut with an audible click. Even the chatter from the coffee shop door thinned into a hush. Inside the crate, Ranger shifted forward again, drawn toward that familiar cadence. Handler? He didn't know the word in English, but he knew its weight in the way a man stood, the steadiness in his scent. Confusion warred with fear. His paws slid, scraping new skin off already raw pads, a tiny sharp pain that anchored him for half a heartbeat to the present moment. Elena studied Luke more carefully now. The way he balanced his weight, not square to the dog, but angled, offering his side. The way his eyes never fixed directly on Ranger's face. It was how trained people moved around frightened animals, not how tourists did. "And what exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Carter?" she asked. "Because the county commissioner wants this liability gone today." As if summoned, her phone lit up again. She put it on speaker, tired of juggling it. Dalton's voice spilled into the drizzle, thin and clipped. "Elena, I'm watching that video. This kid posted. It's already at 20,000 views. We cannot have a dog that's on the internet for attacking an officer sitting in a taxpayer facility. Make the call. You know what has to be done." Luke's jaw tightened. He hated being on conference calls, even when he wasn't the one being discussed. "Commissioner," he said, surprising even himself with how calm it came out, "that dog's not just a bite case. Look at his posture. He's scanning high, not low. That's a trained threat response. Somebody taught him that. You put him down fast, you'll never know who did the teaching." There was a beat of silence on the line. Jaden's live stream caught every word, comments exploding with question marks and war dog emojis. Dalton finally answered, irritation bleeding through. "And what are you exactly? You got credentials or just opinions from a bar stool?" Luke swallowed the old urge to turn away. "Marine K9, he said simply. 2 tours in Mosul. I know what I'm looking at." Elena glanced from the trembling dog to Luke's weathered face. In Rick's stiff shoulders, in the commissioner's sharp tone, in Ranger's raw panic, she saw a cluster of different kinds of fear crashing into each other. "Give me something concrete," she said, lowering the phone just enough that her words were mostly for Luke. Not just, "He's trained. I've got bite reports and an injured officer." Luke thought of the cabin on the hill, the empty collar on the nail, the years he'd let his guilt grow roots. He thought of the shepherd in the crate, body already paying in blood for mistakes that probably weren't his. 3 days, he said. Let me work him. No one else crowding the crate. No more polls and yelling. If by then you still think he's a lost cause. He let the sentence fall away. They all knew how it ended. Dalton's sigh crackled over the speaker. 3 days? This isn't a rehab retreat, Carter. We're running a county budget. Elena cut in before he could build more steam. George, if he's right and this dog has some kind of background, we're better off knowing it before we put a needle in his vein. It's 3 days, not 3 months. If we rush and it backfires, that's on both our desks. Rick stared at Ranger's crate, remembering the sudden weight on his arm, the flash of teeth, the hot spike of panic that had shot through him like an old nightmare waking up. And what if he tears someone else up in those 3 days, he snapped. Who answers for that? Him? He jerked his chin at Luke. You gonna sign off on that, mountain man? Ranger felt the tension tighten like a wire. Voices rose, sharp and jagged, cutting through the constant hum in his ears. He pressed himself against the back wall of the crate, then sprang forward again, driven by something older than this parking lot argument. In his head, men shouted in another language. Boots pounded. The air shook. Out here, it just sounded like people arguing over paperwork. Dalton finally relented with the weary tone of a man protecting his own seat. Fine, 48 hours, not 72. You want to waste your weekend, Carter? Be my guest. If that dog is not demonstrably safer by then, he is done. I'll put my name on the order myself. The call clicked off, leaving only the rain and Ranger's ragged breathing to fill the space. Elena slid the phone back into her pocket and met Luke's eyes. You heard the man. You've got 2 days. Her voice softened just a touch. There's a side gate you can use. I'll keep the volunteers away from quarantine. No guarantees beyond that. Luke nodded once, like someone accepting a mission he hadn't planned on surviving. Above them, Ranger's ears twitched, catching the change in tone even if he didn't know the words. Near the doorway, half hidden by the frame, Tessa and Guyon watched, fingers still curled around a clipboard she'd forgotten she was holding. She'd seen plenty of scared dogs in the year she'd worked here, some mean for real, some just broken. None had looked like this one, pinned between the past and the present with no idea how to stand still. When Luke stepped toward the gate, Ranger's eyes locked on him, and for the first time all morning, his body stopped moving. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was the smallest crack in the wall around him. The quarantine wing sat off the main kennel like an afterthought, a narrow hallway of concrete and chain link where the loud world of barking and visitor tours went quiet. The air was cooler here, tinged with bleach and something older. Ranger had been moved into the last run on the left, a heavier gate, double latch, like they were afraid his fear might leak out and infect the rest. He paced the length of the run, 10 steps forward, 10 steps back, nails clicking on the sealed floor. The main kennel noise was a distant hum through the walls. In here, every sound came sharp, the buzz of a light, the echo of a mop bucket rolling past. His sides still hurt from throwing himself at steel all morning, but standing still felt worse, like giving danger a clear shot. Late afternoon light slanted through the high glass block window, turning the dust into slow-motion snow. Elena had kept her word. No volunteers clustered near the quarantine runs. Only one person came down the hall now, boots steady on the concrete, a small 3-legged wooden stool tucked under his arm. Ranger smelled him before he saw him. Pine smoke, old leather, something steady. Luke's steps slowed as he reached the run, but he didn't go straight to the gate. Instead, he stopped a good 10 feet back in the center of the hallway and set the stool down facing slightly away. Not square at the dog, not in challenge. He eased himself onto it like he intended to stay a while. From his jacket pocket, he pulled a paperback so worn the spine had forgotten its title. Ranger exploded at the new shape in front of his world. He lunged at the chain link, teeth snapping, body slamming metal. The gate rattled on its hinges, the sound ricocheting down the hall like gunfire. His bark wasn't deep and confident. It came high and ragged, every note lined with panic. This was fight because there was no flight left. Luke didn't flinch. He turned a page. To Ranger, it made no sense. Humans shouted, waved sticks, jabbed with poles. They never sat. They never tilted their shoulders away, never let their eyes slide past him to the floor as if he were just another sound in the room. The man breathed slow and even, the rhythm of someone who wasn't scared of sudden noise. Ranger barked harder, trying to force him into the pattern he knew. At the far end of the hall, near the office door, Tessa watched with her back half-pressed to the wall, clipboard forgotten at her side. She'd seen trainers come and go at other shelters, quick to toss treats or jerk leashes. She had never seen someone sit like a rock and let a dog storm crash over them without moving. "What are you doing?" she whispered under her breath like he could hear. Ranger's voice burned his throat, but he kept going. His paws started to sting, pads scraping raw where they hit the floor and bounced off the gate. Each impact fed the roar in his skull, that awful white noise of memory. Sand and sirens, not bleach and humming lights. Still, the man on the stool did nothing but trace invisible lines across the page and occasionally wet his lips with coffee-roughened breath. Eventually, the rhythm broke. It always did, even in the worst places. Ranger's bark cracked, dropping to a hoarse growl, then to a series of frustrated huffs. He backed away from the fence, panting, tongue heavy in his mouth. The man didn't press his advantage. He didn't stand or step forward. He simply turned another page, the paper making a small, ordinary sound that did not match the pounding in Ranger's chest. Confusion crept in around the edges of Ranger's fear. His ears, flattened hard against his skull, inched forward a fraction. He sank onto his belly near the back wall, eyes locked on the figure in the hallway. There was no stick, no leash, no hands reaching in. Only the scent of a human who didn't want anything from him yet, and the soft rasp of fingers moving over paper. While the standoff held in the quarantine wing, Tessa slipped into the intake office, heart still thudding from what she'd seen. She set her clipboard down, woke up the shelter computer, and pulled up Ranger's file. Owner name, redacted, replaced by a corporate P.O. box from a private security firm 3 towns over. Microchip, scanned on arrival, marked Restricted Contact DOD Registry. Her brow furrowed. She dug into the physical folder, flipping past the standard surrender form, the quick scrawl about uncontrollable, dangerous. Behind it, in the plastic sleeve most people never checked, a faint photocopy showed a government seal blurred at the edges. Under it, a line of type. Military working dog. Disposition. Transferred. The dog ID number began with letters she recognized from news stories, not pet shops. Tessa's throat tightened. She ran her fingers along the faded ink, like it could talk back. Out in the hall, she could still hear Ranger's breathing between the muffled clink of the gate. Did anybody here know who they had locked in that run? Or had he been just another problem offloaded onto an already crowded shelter? She snapped a quick photo of the document with her phone before sliding it carefully back into place. When she returned to the hallway, the noise had changed. Ranger wasn't slamming himself into the gate anymore. He lay stretched out halfway between the back wall and the door, still tense, still wired, but his chest moved slower. Luke hadn't moved from the stool. The book sat closed in his lap now, his hands resting on it, fingers loose. His head was bowed like a man in an old country church. Ranger watched him, ears now fully upright, swiveling with each small sound in the wing. His nose worked the air, pulling in more details. The man carried the ghost of other dogs on his clothes, faint and old, like a scent remembered from a different life. Under it, the metallic tang of something artificial at his wrist, the mixed smell of human skin and forged steel. Broken, but not weak. The light outside dimmed as afternoon leaned into evening. Elena's footsteps sounded once at the far end, hesitated, then retreated, leaving them their bubble of uneasy peace. Tessa stayed where she was, halfway between door and run, afraid to break whatever fragile thread had settled between man and dog. Ranger's eyes drifted half-closed, not in trust, not yet, but in surrender to exhaustion. When Luke finally rose from the stool, his knees complained in a small crackle. Ranger's head snapped up, body tensing for the next blow, the next command, the next something. But Luke only nodded once in his direction, like one soldier acknowledging another at the end of a long watch. He carried the stool down the hall without a backward glance. Behind him, for the first time since he'd arrived at the shelter, Ranger didn't leap at the gate. He simply watched the space where the man had been, ears tilted forward, listening for the sound of those footsteps coming back. On Daru, night settled over Astoria like a damp blanket, soft but heavy. The main kennel had gone dark except for a strip of security lights, dogs shifting and sighing in their sleep. In the quarantine wing, the hum of the fluorescent fixtures sounded louder than usual. Ranger lay on the cool concrete, ribs rising and falling in a slow, uneasy rhythm. He had stopped throwing himself at the gate hours ago, not because the fear was gone, but because his body had nothing left to burn. The skin on his paws was tender, each tiny movement sending a sting up his legs. Every so often, his eyes would snap open, ears twitching for footsteps. Twice now, the steady man with the stool had come, sat, and left. Ranger didn't understand it, but his mind kept circling around that calm like a dog around a buried bone. Down the hall, tucked just out of Ranger's sightline, Luke sat on an overturned bucket, shoulders hunched, elbows on his knees. The stool was beside him, unused. The day had left its weight on his back. Tessa leaned against the opposite wall, nursing a paper cup of vending machine coffee gone lukewarm. Between them, the silence felt less like empty space and more like a crowded room neither one wanted to cross. "You know his chip hits a DOD registry, right?" Tessa said quietly, glancing toward Ranger's run. That photocopy in his file? It's for a military working dog transfer. He's not just some junkyard bite case. Luke had suspected, but hearing it out loud pressed something tighter around his chest. Yeah, he murmured. You can smell that kind of life on them. Doesn't wash off. Tessa studied his profile, the hard line of his jaw, the way his fingers knotted together. Did you have one? She asked, not sure if she was stepping on a landmine. Luke's eyes stayed on the floor. Atlas, he said after a beat. Just the name. It sat between them like another person. He was better than most men I ever served with. His voice went rough on that last word, like it scraped over gravel. What happened? The question came out gentler than she expected. She was used to people dumping stories on her without asking if she wanted them. Luke hesitated, then let out a breath that sounded more like surrender than relief. He died because I pushed him, he said. We were smoked, 20 hours on our feet. He gave me an alert, subtle, like he'd done 100 times. I hesitated. Thought maybe he was just hot. I sent him anyway. In Ranger's run, the air shifted with the change in Luke's tone. Ranger's ears tipped toward the voices, catching the low cadence of confession. He couldn't parse the words, but he recognized the sound. Soldiers talked like that. In the dark, low, and thick, when the world had gone quiet, but their heads hadn't. He raised his head from his paws, nostrils flaring. Luke's hand drifted unconsciously to the cuff on his left sleeve. They told me it was just bad luck, he went on. IED placed wrong, timing off, nothing I could have done. But I know what I did. I overrode my dog. I sent him forward when everything in him said back. He didn't make a sound, just went. And I've been living with that bad call ever since. The words lay raw between them. Tessa didn't fill the silence with easy comfort. She'd seen enough guilt to know when it was welded on. Instead, she asked the question that had been bothering her since she'd read Ranger's file. Have you ever checked with anyone from your unit? To see if your version is the only one? Luke looked up, startled. What do you mean? Memories lie, she said softly, especially the loud ones. Her suggestion hung in the stale hallway air. Luke felt his gut twist. He'd spent 10 years avoiding the past so hard he'd never thought to verify it. There's one number I've still got, he admitted. Miguel, spotter from our team. I haven't called him since. He didn't finish. The sentence ended back in the desert. Tessa nodded toward the front. There's a payphone at the gas station by the bridge. It still works. I use it when my cell dies. Outside, clouds had been stacking over the river all evening, heavy and low. By the time Luke stepped into the shelter lot, the first faint rumbles rolled across the sky. Ranger heard them before the humans did. A low tremor, distant but familiar, vibrated through the building. He went rigid, eyes widening, tail drawing in tight. The thin line between this place and that other place blurred. At the gas station, harsh fluorescent light painted the concrete a sickly color. The payphone hung on the wall between the restrooms, its metal chipped and scuffed. Luke fed coins into the slot with fingers that felt clumsier than they should. He unfolded an old scrap of paper from his wallet, the numbers smudged but still legible. When the line began to ring, his pulse beat time with it. Back at the shelter, the storm closed in. Thunder cracked closer now, sharp and sudden. In the quarantine run, Ranger shot to his feet, nails scrabbling on the slick floor. The boom ripped through him like a command. He was no longer in a narrow concrete wing in Oregon. He was back where the sky spit fire and the ground bit back. He threw himself at the gate, not at a man, but at the sound itself, desperate to outrun it. When Miguel answered, his voice came thick with sleep. Yeah? Luke swallowed hard. Mig, it's Luke Carter. There was a long pause on the line, the kind that made a man want to hang up. Finally, Miguel's tone sharpened. You're alive. It wasn't quite an accusation, but it wasn't far from one. Luke leaned his forehead against the metal frame. Barely, he said. I needed to talk about Atlas. Miguel's breath hitched audibly. Silence, then a rustle, like he was sitting up. What about him? Luke's voice dropped. I need to say it straight. I pushed him on that IED. I second-guessed his alert. I sent him forward. I got him killed. He waited for agreement, for the verdict he'd already been living under. On the other end, Miguel made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a curse. Is that what you've been telling yourself all this time? Dawn crept in behind the storm, gray and hesitant, as if the sky wasn't sure it was welcome yet. In the quarantine wing, one fluorescent tube still flickered, casting a pale stripe across the empty run at the end of the hall. The gate swung, slightly on its hinges, bumping the frame with a soft, hollow tap. Where Ranger should have been, there was only a dark smear of wet paw prints. Sometime in the night, when thunder climbed right on top of the building and the sound turned solid, Ranger's mind had snapped the last tie to this quiet place. In his head, the walls dissolved back into broken stone. The flash of lightning became muzzle blast. He'd thrown himself again and again against the door until the latch, hastily set, slipped. Fear had done what rage never could. He had not escaped so much as fled. Out the service door, across the narrow strip of grass, claws digging mud, heart trying to outrun the sound. The rain had slammed into his face like a wall, but water was easier than shrapnel. Down the alley, past dumpsters and the sour smell of old oil, his nose chased any scent that wasn't smoke and blood. The hill above town pulled at him like a memory. By the time Rick arrived for his early shift, the storm had moved off over the river, leaving the streets shining and the air raw. He walked the hall with a paper cup of coffee in one hand and the uneasy hope that the night had smoothed something out of the shepherd. The sight of the empty run froze him cold. The cup hit the floor, coffee splashing his boots as his chest seized. For a long beat, all he could hear was his own breathing. Then training and anger rushed back in to fill the gap. He keyed his radio with a hand that shook more than he liked. Dispatch, this is Daniels at the shelter. We've got a level 4 bite dog loose. German Shepherd, male, black and tan. Last seen in quarantine. I am armed and in pursuit. The words tasted like metal. Ranger had already cleared the last houses by then. His world narrowed to scent and slope. The town fell away behind him, the sharp angles of roofs giving way to the softer lines of trees. Wet ferns slapped his belly, the ground beneath the duff slick and uneven. Every crack of a branch overhead made him flinch, eyes jerking upward. But there was no rooftop shooter here, only crows complaining. There were other smells on the hill, old ones, deer, raccoon, damp wood. Under it all, faint but there, was something that caught him harder than the rest. The ghost of another dog, long gone, and the man who had walked with him. Pine smoke, diesel, human sweat folded around a trace of cordite and sand. Ranger followed that ghost scent like a rope, lungs burning, pads splitting open. Back at the base of the hill, patrol cars rolled in one by one, lights off but radios crackling. Elena arrived with her hair half pulled back, sneakers wet, heart lodged somewhere near her throat. Tessa jumped out of her little hatchback, still zipping her jacket, eyes wide when she saw the open field gate. "He went up there?" she breathed. "Oh, buddy, wrong direction." Rick checked his rifle with practiced motions, jaw locked. The last time a large dog had taken him off his feet, he'd woken up staring at a ceiling he didn't recognize. "I won't let that happen again," he muttered, mostly to himself, as he started for the trailhead. His shoulders were stiff enough to creak. In his mind, Ranger was already coming for him out of the brush, teeth first. A pickup pulled in, parking a little crooked at the edge of the gravel. Luke stepped down, reading the cluster of uniforms, the tight faces, the way everyone kept glancing toward the tree line. He didn't need to ask what had happened. He could feel it in the air, like the leftover charge from the storm. Somewhere above them, a dog trained for war was alone and bleeding. Chief Morgan, gray-haired and broad through the shoulders, stood with his hands on his hips, taking it all in. He'd come out of retirement more for the coffee than the meetings, but there were some days he still felt like the town's spine. He watched Rick adjust his grip on the rifle, saw the white around the younger man's mouth. "You're carrying too much to carry that today, son," he said quietly. Rick bristled. "With respect, Chief, I'm the one he bit. I know what he's capable of." Morgan's eyes were kind but firm. "And I know what you're capable of when that old memory grabs you by the neck. You see that dog, you're not going to see fur. You're going to see every bad thing that's ever laid you out. That's how accidents happen." He took the rifle, leaving Rick with empty hands and shaking breath. All of that talk, the shifting feet, the low radio chatter, meant nothing to Ranger. Higher on the hill, he had found his way into the skeleton of an old lumber yard, where stacks of forgotten boards leaned like crooked teeth. The ground here was a mess of splinters and wire, and in one panicked leap he had driven his hind leg straight into a tangle. Metal bit deep, stopping him cold. Pain dropped the world into sharp focus. He twisted and jerked, but the more he fought, the deeper the old fence wire cut. Blood slicked his fur, turning the tan to a rusty smear. He snapped at the wire, teeth scraping uselessly off metal, breath coming in harsh bursts. The storm was gone, but inside his skull it still raged. Up above, gulls wheeled and cried, and every pass sounded like incoming rounds. At the foot of the hill, Elena looked from the trees to Luke. The night before had left something different in the set of his shoulders, a new weight, or maybe an old one finally acknowledged. "You said you could read him?" she said. "Can you find him?" Luke glanced up at the clouds snagged on the treetops, then back at the ground, as if tracing tracks only he could see. Chief Morgan shifted his stance, the rifle resting easy in his arm, but pointed down. "You know this hill," he told Luke. "He doesn't. He's hurt, scared, and wired for a fight he's not in anymore. I can't send jittery men with guns after that combination. You want this dog to have a shot, you go get him. 24 hours. After that, Dalton will sign whatever paper he has to." Luke felt every pair of eyes on him, but the only ones that mattered were higher up, worried and alone. He nodded once. "He's not hunting," he said. "He's running from ghosts. I know the route they take." He adjusted his jacket, tugged the cuff over his left wrist out of habit, then started up the trail. As he disappeared into the trees, Ranger lay trapped in the lumber yard, sides heaving, ears straining toward the faint sound of a man pushing through wet brush, bringing with him the familiar scent of a life he had almost forgotten he'd lived. The climb to the old lumber yard was slow and steady, the kind of uphill that made a man feel every year in his knees. Luke moved through wet brush, pushing aside ferns, boots sinking into the softened ground. Above him, the broken frame of the yard sat crooked against the gray sky, stacks of old boards leaning like tired shoulders. Ranger smelled him before he saw him. Under the sharp reek of rust and his own blood, that scent cut through. Pine smoke, wool, old canvas, something metallic and human. His ears pricked forward, torn between hope and fear. Every instinct screamed that being found while trapped meant one thing. Yet his chest eased just a fraction at that familiar trace. The wire around his hind leg had tightened with every struggle. Flesh swelled against metal, hot and throbbing. Ranger lay on his side now, panting, flanks quivering with each breath. When a shape appeared at the edge of the stacked boards, he jerked his head up, lips peeling back in a warning he could barely back up anymore. Pain stole the power from his growl. Luke stopped just short of the last pile, taking in the scene with a soldier's quick scan. The dog's leg was tangled deep in old fence wire, fur slick dark. One bad move and Ranger would cut himself worse. The boards above him looked ready to slide. "Easy, buddy," Luke murmured, voice low and even. "You picked a hell of a foxhole, didn't you?" Ranger's eyes locked on him, wild and glassy. This was not the quiet man with the book in a hallway. This was a figure standing over him, boots on broken wood, hands free. Every memory of shouting men, of rough grabs and blows, rushed back. He snapped in the air, teeth clacking on nothing, because that was all he had left to offer. Instead of looming closer, Luke eased down onto one knee a few feet away, body angled, eyes not quite meeting Ranger's. His hands stayed open and empty on his thighs. He let the quiet sit with them, letting the dog hear his breathing, slow and measured, not spiked with the sharp edges of anger. "I'm not here to finish you," he said. "I'm here because I know what it's like to be stuck." Wind slid through the broken yard, rattling loose nails and flapping a strip of old tarp somewhere above. Ranger's gaze flicked up at the sound, heart kicking, then dropped back to the man. There was something off in the scent near his left side, the smell of heated metal under the wool. He whined, high and confused, not used to his own uncertainty. Luke looked at the wire, at the blood already clotting in dull clumps on Ranger's fur. To reach it, he'd have to get close enough to be in range of those teeth, close enough to lay his own damaged body down beside the dog's. He had spent 10 years hiding the worst of his scars from everyone, including himself. Right now, hiding wasn't going to cut it. Slowly, so Ranger could track every motion, Luke reached for his left cuff. "You're not the only one that came home in pieces," he said softly. The fabric hissed as he folded it back. Underneath, the skin was ridged and uneven, burned scars twisted around the base of a forearm that ended too soon. Below that, the dull shine of a prosthetic, scratched and worn. Ranger went still. The sharp chemical tang of metal and machine was there, but wrapped in the familiar musk of a man who had bled and sweated beside other dogs. On the ruined skin above the join, ink marked a unit patch and a K9 designation, lines warped but still clear. It was a story written where everyone could see, for anyone who knew how to read it. Luke stretched that arm out first, the one half made of something unbreakable. He laid his hand on the board closest to Ranger, palm down, fingers relaxed. "You see?" he murmured. "They took a piece of me, too. Doesn't mean we're done, just means we're different now." The metal fingers didn't tremble. The rest of him did. For a long heartbeat, nothing moved. Then Ranger's nose inched forward, nostrils flaring. He drew in the scent of old smoke, disinfectant, machine grease, and underneath it all, the steady salt of human skin. His body trembled, not with rage this time, but with the strain of choosing. Very slowly, he stretched his neck and touched his nose to the scarred wrist. The contact was brief, a question more than an answer. Luke didn't flinch. Ranger's tongue flicked out once, tasting the ridge of burned flesh where fur should have been on a foreleg. It was wrong, but it was honest. Something in his shoulders dropped a fraction. The growl in his throat faded to a low, rough breath. The wire around his leg was still a trap, but the man no longer felt like one. Taking that as the only permission he was going to get, Luke shifted closer on his side, keeping his metal arm where Ranger could see it. With his good hand, he reached for the tangle of wire, fingers careful and slow. "Okay, soldier," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "You hold still for me now. One of us panics, we both bleed." The wire fought him, biting his knuckles, tightening when Ranger's muscles spasmed. Twice he had to stop and wait, letting the dog ride out a wave of pain without yanking against it. Ranger's breath puffed hot against his sleeve, panting in little bursts, but he didn't clamp down on Luke's arm. He fixed his gaze on that metal hand instead, as if it were an anchor. At last, the worst of the loop gave. Luke slid the last twist free, easing Ranger's leg out of the steel's grip. The fur was crushed and red, the skin underneath angry and torn, but the limb was whole. Ranger tried to stand too fast, leg buckling, and Luke slipped an arm under his chest, taking some of the weight. "Easy, easy, one thing at a time. We're not sprinting, we're just going home." The first step was ugly. Ranger's injured leg barely brushed the ground, and his body swayed with the effort, but he stayed on his feet, pressed tight against Luke's side, the way working dogs did when the terrain turned bad. Together, they picked their way out of the lumber yard, each careful placement of paw and boot, a quiet promise not to let the other fall. Above them, the sky had started to lighten, a pale stripe opening over the river, as the hill gave back two shapes instead of one. The town hall smelled like old wood and coffee that had been reheated too many times. Folding chairs filled the room in crooked rows, every seat taken by faces Luke mostly recognized, but rarely looked at. At the front, a projector cast a pale rectangle on the wall, waiting. Under the first row, Ranger lay on his unbandaged side, head between his paws, leash looped loosely in Luke's hand. Commissioner Dalton straightened his tie like the room was a camera he needed to charm. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," he began, voice smooth. "We're here to address a public safety issue involving a dangerous animal." The word animal hung just long enough for a murmur to ripple through the crowd. A couple of people eyed Ranger like he might explode. On cue, a video flickered to life on the wall. Jaden's first clip. Ranger in the parking lot, hurling himself against the crate. Rick's shout, the flash of teeth, the chaos. Gasps and clucks of disapproval rose from the chairs. Rick shifted where he stood against the wall, his wounded arm in a fresh brace. He couldn't quite make himself watch, but he couldn't look away either. Near the aisle, Elena sat with her hands knotted in her lap. Tessa was beside her, phone face down for once. Between them, the leash ran back to Ranger. Feeling the tension travel the line, Ranger's ears tipped back, picking up the sharpness in human voices, the same way he'd once listened for the click of a safety being flipped off. He pressed closer to Luke's boot, a quiet question. Dalton paused the video on Ranger's open jaws. "This is what we're dealing with," he said. "We cannot ignore the risk of keeping such an animal in our care. Officer Daniels is already injured. Next time, it might be a child." He let the fear hang in the air, heavy and familiar, the kind that made people nod without thinking. A few heads bobbed as if on strings. Before he could launch into his prepared speech, a second image cut across the wall. Another video had taken over the feed, shakier, closer to the ground. Ranger, muddy and limping, walking down from the hill pressed against Luke's side, leash loose, head low, but eyes clear. Jaden stood by the projector, thumbs dancing over his phone, cheeks flushed. "Sorry, Commissioner," he said, "but they ought to see this too." The room quieted in a different way. It wasn't the hush of fear, but the pause of people seeing new information land in a place they thought was settled. On the wall, Luke's hand brushed Ranger's shoulder, steadying him across a washed-out patch of trail. The dog did not lunge, did not bare teeth. He checked in with the man the way trained dogs did, looking for instruction that never turned cruel. Dalton's jaw ticked, but he forced a smile. "Apparently we have more angles," he said tightly. "All the more reason to hear from those directly involved." His gaze slid to Luke like a weight. "Mr. Carter, since you've taken a special interest, perhaps you'd like to explain why this dog deserves another chance after attacking an officer." The word attacking came out sharper than the rest. Luke could have stayed seated. No law said he had to stand up. But the steady weight of Ranger's head against his boot, the memory of Miguel's voice on the payphone, and the scars he'd finally stopped hiding pushed him to his feet. He walked to the front with the uneven grace of a man whose body had learned to work around damage and kept going anyway. For a moment he faced the crowd with his hands in his pockets, shoulders turned slightly, like he'd rather be anywhere else. Then he took a breath, slid his left hand free, and reached for his cuff. The fabric rasped as he folded it back, exposing the twisted skin, the unit tattoo, and the dull shine of the prosthetic beneath. Gasps echoed, softer this time, shaped more by surprise than fear. "This," he said quietly, "is what I brought home from my war." He brought his home too. He nodded toward Ranger, who had lifted his head, ears tipped forward. "He's not a monster that woke up one morning and decided to bite folks. He's a military working dog that got passed around and pushed past his limit. Every time that sky shakes, he's back over there, whether you believe it or not." He told them, in plain words, about Atlas, about the day he'd spent 10 years blaming himself for, about calling Miguel and hearing for the first time that his memory had been twisted by guilt, that his dog had died saving a man, not because of a bad order. He spoke slowly, like walking over broken glass, not looking for pity, just making sure the truth finally had a place to sit. Then he turned to the story that lay at his feet. "Ranger's chip hits the same registry mine used to. He scanned the roofs looking for threats. He didn't go for Officer Daniel's throat in that lot. He hit the nearest way out of a noise he couldn't understand. When he ran last night, he didn't go after anyone. He got himself tangled up in a trap and stayed there, bleeding, until someone came who smelled like the life he lost." Across the room, Rick shifted again, the brace on his arm creaking. The memory of teeth in his flesh still made his heart race, but seeing Ranger now, stretched on his side, bandage wrapped neat around his leg, didn't match the monster from his dreams. "I was scared," he said into the hush, surprising himself. "Still am some days. But if I'm being straight, he didn't track me. I stepped too close. I won't sign off on killing him for that." Chief Morgan nodded once, like a judge who had been waiting for that admission. "There it is," he said. "We can honor what he's done and still respect what he's carrying, same as we do with any veteran." He looked around the room. "We've got broken men sitting in church basements and VFW halls all over this county, trying to figure out how to live with what they brought back. You tell me this dog doesn't fit right in that picture." The meeting didn't end in a neat cheer or a dramatic slam of a gavel. It ended in murmurs and slow nods, in small groups forming to argue details and logistics. But when the vote was finally called, the room tipped toward something new. No euthanasia. Ranger would stay, not as a ticking bomb, but as the first official member of a program Elena and Tessa had already begun to sketch on scrap paper, "Second Tour." Months later, the sign looked almost professional. "Second Tour, Veterans and Working Dogs," painted in clean letters on a board by the shelter's side lot. In the yard beyond, a handful of dogs moved at different paces, some confident, some still hugging the shadows. A small circle of men and women in worn jackets and old unit caps stood with them, hands in pockets, eyes softer than their faces. Ranger lay in the patchy sun by the fence, scarred legs stretched out, tracking the group with the careful attention of a sentry on a safe post. Now and then a new noise would make him flinch, a car backfire or a dropped metal bowl, and his head would snap up, ears sharp. But there was always a voice to bring him back. Tessa's laugh, Elena's steady call, or Luke's low murmur drifting over from the porch. Luke didn't live on the hill alone anymore. His truck still knew the road by heart, but there was a small apartment over the shelter's office now that smelled of coffee, dog shampoo, and old leather. The empty collar from his cabin wall had found a new place on a shelf, not as a sentence, but as a keepsake. When he sat on the steps at the end of the day, Ranger settled beside him without a leash, choosing the spot. On some evenings, Jaden would wander by, camera hanging unused around his neck, not everything a story for the internet anymore. He'd sit on the ground, just out of reach, and listen while the older vets swapped stories about sand and snow and the strange quiet that came after. Ranger would drift from person to person, offering a warm shoulder, taking steadying hands in return. To people driving past on the main road, it looked like any other small-town shelter, a little worn at the edges, but hanging on. They didn't see the way Ranger's eyes had changed, how the frantic white around the iris had eased into something deeper, or how Luke's shoulders sat a little lower, as if some invisible pack had finally been set down. They didn't hear the soft commands traded like old currency between those who'd walked through fire. Ranger would never forget the things that had shaped him. There were still nights when storms rolled in off the Pacific, and he paced the length of his run, tail low, ears working overtime. On those nights, Luke sat with him, not with a stool and a book anymore, but with his back against the gate, sleeve pushed up without thinking, metal hand resting where fur met wire. Two veterans listening to the sky and waiting for it to quiet. In the end, nobody really tamed the German shepherd the town had been so sure about. What they did was learn his language and let him teach them some of theirs in return. When a new dog arrived shaking, or a man walked in with haunted eyes, it was often Ranger who reached them first, bridge and mirror all at once. The truth Luke had once been ashamed to show sat on his arm in plain sight, and at his feet lay the proof that some battles, even the old ones, could still turn out differently. If you made it this far, tell me you're still here by dropping a simple 1 in the comments. It helps more than you think, and if stories like this speak to you, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. We've got more heartfelt moments, more loyal dogs, and more true-to-life journeys coming your way. Stay with us. The next story might be the one you remember most.